Good morning. Welcome back to the Papa Bless podcast, where we discuss everything from health, well-being, education, or dramas currently taking over the Indonesian FYP by storm. I'm Kenneth Johnson, and I'm going to be your host for today. And today's topic, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pretty sure is not foreign to you who haven't been living under a rock, as it had its run on social media. Just last week, the official social media account by the tag at Yusuf _official ran by the famed litigation lawyer Yusuf Imran posted an educational TikTok video where he touched upon the concept of do not resuscitate, or commonly referred to as DNR, and how it is surprisingly not really acknowledged in Indonesia. And to which many caught wind of the topic, and the traction then soon escalated into a wild debate within the comment section on how it would simply be unethical to set aside one's rights. And whilst many were debating on the ethicality of the practice, a lawyer by the name of Zidny Ilman, who goes by the account tag of Legalese by Zidny, believed that Yusuf's points were rather misleading. And wanting to get his points across, Zidny then stitched Yusuf's video to argue that DNR is in fact legally recognized and its violation is a breach of a patient's rights. Rather than letting the two of them duke it out on the internet, I've decided to invite them both to the podcast, together with a renowned health law expert with a PhD in medical law at Universitas Indonesia, Professor Dr. Syaddad Sumartadinata, SHMH. Gentlemen, welcome. Because today's podcast is rather unconventional, it is important to note that our main goal today is to educate our listeners and the general public. And I know that that is something that all three of you guys are very passionate about. So let's try to keep things very respectful, but let's also have a very lively debate. Professor Syaddad, your guidance in keeping this discussion on track from a doctrinal perspective would be greatly appreciated. And so to kickstart our discussion today, let's begin with you. Could you perhaps break down or introduce to us the concept of the DNR and perhaps touch upon the roots? I understand that this ties deeply into the balance of individual and social rights, and perhaps explain to a layman why one would not want a second chance.
You're absolutely correct. Fundamental human rights can broadly be divided into two: social rights and individual rights. Social rights include the right to healthcare, the right to medical treatment, and individual rights include the right to self-determination, which encompasses confidentiality and bodily integrity. Now the question arises, what exactly is the right to bodily integrity? The right to bodily integrity includes informed consent, this right to know what medical procedures will be performed and to choose the care one receives. It also includes the right to refuse medical treatment. In Indonesia, this principle is actually enshrined into law in law number 17 of 2023, which provides that every person has the right to accept or refuse part or all of this medical assistance offered after receiving and understanding complete information. Now, circling back to your question, I want to first explain what DNR is, and just to start off the discussion. Simply put, DNR is a written instruction. When a patient's heart stops, a DNR is basically in order not to attempt CPR. It doesn't mean that patient should not be treated. It just means that don't attempt to do CPR. Now, perhaps the question arises, why is CPR not attractive? Perhaps in movies, the CPR is heroic or is very easy.
Right.
But in reality, it's pretty hard. When you do CPR, you can break a person's ribs. And for terminally ill patients, this might not be attractive because that might lower their quality of health and the chances of them surviving in the first place. So that might be a consideration.
That is very interesting. And that really changed my perspective on CPR and also the general DNR practice. Now that we have the pillars of our discussion established, perhaps we can shift our discussion into what is consensus. And here are two lawyers who have different opinions on how the Indonesian DNR practice takes place. Let's start with you, Yusuf. In your opinion, as a practitioner, do you believe that the DNR practice is acknowledged and is in practice in Indonesia?
First of all, let me clarify my position. My argument is not that DNR never happens in Indonesian hospitals. It is that DNR is not clearly regulated in Indonesian law. The term DNR itself is not clearly defined in our main laws. There is no specific legal framework that tells us exactly what DNR means, who can request it, how consent must be given, and how patient capacity is assessed, and what happens if the family disagrees. So when I say DNR is not legally recognized, I meant it is not recognized in a complete and legally certain way.
Okay, if I may also add on to a little bit. But I would like to add, I have 3 points here. First, the term itself is actually recognized. The Ministry of Health's National Clinical Practice Guideline identifies DNR as a contraindication to CPR, just as Professor Syaddad mentioned. If DNR is a contraindication, healthcare professionals are expected not to perform CPR when a valid DNR order exists. Second, the concept is also recognized in law. Article 14 of Case 37/2014 allows life-sustaining treatment to be withheld for terminal, incurable patients. Furthermore, Article 14, paragraph 5, letter B, includes CPR among the measures that may be withheld.
Nice.
And finally, the law protects these decisions. Article 2 provides legal protection for patients and healthcare workers, while Article 192 of the Health Law removes liability where treatment is refused after a proper medical explanation. So, if DNR is not recognized in Indonesia, I have a couple of questions. Why do official guidelines mention it by name? And why does the law permit withholding CPR and protect those who honor that decision?
Do you have anything to say or in response to that, Yusuf?
Yes, I get your point, Zidny, indeed. And I agree that those provisions exist, including Article 192 of the Health Law. However, my concern is that Article 192 only protects the refusal of discontinuation of treatment after a comprehensive medical explanation. It does not by itself tell us the full procedure for DNR. Case 37/2014, the Health Law, and Kodeki all points in the same direction, but they still leave practical questions open. For example, what happens if the patient arrives unconscious? What happens if the hospital sees a DNR wristband but does not know whether it was validly issued?
Right.
What if the family disagrees with the patient's earlier wish? So I am not saying DNR has no basis at all. I am saying the basis is still too scattered. And for something this serious, Indonesia needs a clearer and more specific regulation.
Okay, Professor Syaddad, I see that you're in agreement with what Yusuf shared earlier. Can you perhaps share your 2 cents on this matter?
Well, of course, I don't mean to take sides on this lively discussion, but I just want to make it clear in this podcast that DNR is practiced in Indonesia. First of all, it is explicitly stated, of course, within context in Article 17 of the Kode Etik Kedokteran Indonesia. Kode Etik clearly acknowledges DNR and supports healthcare workers who follow DNR orders. Now, I want to make it clear, DNR is a real and established practice here in Indonesia.
Okay, that is a very interesting point here. Building on that, I'd love to get your thoughts on where Indonesia goes from here, Professor Syaddad. From your academic standpoint, and perhaps from Yusuf and Zidny as well, from your experiences as a practitioner, what is your outlook on Indonesia's future on accepting DNR?
Well, I'm pretty optimistic if you ask me. Internationally speaking, at least Denmark has expanded DNR orders across transitions of care and improved documentation practices. Even Saudi Arabia, of all places, which operates under 1988 a framework, has survey data showing that most physicians support programs to improve DNR practice.
And to add to that, I think from the last thing that Yusuf was saying previously, there's this intersection between our opposing views. And in response to what Professor Syaddad was just saying, I don't think Indonesia even has to go that far. We already have the framework within the health law.
Correct.
Yeah, and the permanent case explicitly naming CPR withholding mechanism and the aforementioned coding provision an actual documented practice. So all we need, as Yusuf was saying, is just single statute level provision about DNR.
Well, I couldn't agree more. We need to make things clear for our patients and doctors, honestly.
I am very happy to be part of such fruitful discussion, and I think that is the perfect note for all of us to wrap up on, and that actually brings us to the end of our discussion, because we all happen to agree on the same solution to this recurring contentious matter. And yeah, I just would like to say a massive thank you for Professor Syaddad, Yusuf, and also Mr. Zidny for showing up to this podcast and sharing with me your incredible insights. Thank you so much. And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in into this episode of the Papa Bless Podcast.